Hello and welcome everybody to Quality Conversations, stories and strategies from leaders shaping life sciences. And today we have with you, today is Phil Desjardins.
Perfect.
Did I say it right? All right. Awesome. Phil's with Arnold and Porter. Phil, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? Give us some background.
Sure. Thanks, Shawn. I'm a partner at the law firm of Arnold Porter. My practice focuses almost exclusively on regulatory and quality issues, largely with medical device diagnostic clients. Do a little bit of combination products work. I dabble a little bit in the biologics and pharmaceuticals, but I've got other partners who are much more knowledgeable in that space. So that's where I've been doing right now. By way of background, I'm an FDA regulatory quality expert, spent 10 years at the agency, another almost 10 years at Johnson Johnson in their MedTech business. Again, sitting on the quality and regulatory leadership teams, running regulatory for a number of their businesses. And as I said before, now helping multiple clients out dealing with some of these issues and challenges with the agency and global regulatory strategies.
So you were attorney before the FDA, correct?
Correct. I joke to my friends and my wife, I've always been an attorney, but now that I'm back at a law firm, it feels like I'm a real attorney again. So the way I used to describe it, both at the agency and at Johnson Johnson, I had the JD, I'm barred, but those jobs didn't necessarily technically require that you be a lawyer. You're not going into court, you're not technically representing clients, but that JD and legal training's always been valuable in all the roles that I've had.
So how do you decide as an attorney, I want to go into FDA, the life sciences space?
So you frame the question, how does someone or how do people normally do that? I'd say for most people, or most of the conversation I've had, people sort of, it finds them.
Sure.
Meaning it's not something they seek out. They get into, maybe it's a regulated industry sort of role and they are drawn towards the quality or the regulatory side of things. Maybe an opportunity for a promotion popped up. They went from engineering over there. My story is a little bit different. I went to law school knowing, or at least thinking, I wanted to get into an FDA regulated practice in business. At the time, I didn't even know FDA regulated medical devices, so it was entirely pharmaceutical focused. But growing up, both my parents were involved in not necessarily regulatory affairs, but the pharmaceutical drug development process. Both were in clinical trial design, either as our principal investigator or as a CRA working for CROs. So our dinner table conversations were around stage 2, stage 3 clinical trials, what's happening with this different, what are adverse events, like what's a reasonable safety risk profile for a therapeutic sort of product in general. So I'd say I knew just enough, not even to be dangerous, but just to know that it was out there and it was something that interested me. Undergrad, I studied biology and chemistry, came out, worked in a lab for that first year right out of undergraduate and realized pretty quickly, although I like the academic learning and working in a lab and those experiments, doing it in practice professionally just wasn't as rewarding as I thought it was going to be. So when I thought about, all right, what type of career do I want to create for myself? This idea of regulatory clinical therapy development sort of popped back into my head. And I thought attacking it from a legal perspective would be a unique way to approach that. Neither of my parents are lawyers, but I knew there was a lot of regulations, a lot of bureaucracy around that process. And I thought it's something I understood enough about that I wanted to learn more about it and thought I could make a career out of it. And now, I think 21 years later, I've proven that's the case and really enjoying the work that I do on a daily basis.
Wow. Somebody who knew they wanted to go into
I don't know if that makes me the ultimate nerd or the opposite. I don't know either way, but it was definitely, it was part of the plan earlier on. And as you're on the journey, you never know how it's going to play out. But I have a funny little anecdote. Whenever anyone's in, whether it's undergrad or even high school or graduate school, what I put air quotes around what adults would ask you is, what do you want to do? And they didn't say this part out loud. They'd say, what do you want to do when you grow up? They didn't say the when you grow up part, but that's how I interpreted it. And I always had this stock answer. Well, I want to get into an FDA regulatory practice. I'd explain a little bit about my background, what I understood about it. And you say that to enough people, particularly in the DC area, somebody's bound to know somebody. So I think I had that conversation once at a dinner party and somebody said, oh, why don't you send me your resume? I think I know somebody who does something similar. And a couple of days later, I get a call from FDA and they say, hey, why don't you come down for an interview? And I didn't even know what I was interviewing for, but I show up there. I'm in my second year of law school. And I walk out the door with an offer to work part-time. This is during the summer between my first and second years of law school. At CDRH. And that's where I learned for the first time that FDA even regulates medical devices, but really got to learn by doing, got some really great experiences earlier on at the agency.
Interesting. So what would you say was one of the most challenging parts along your journey for the past 21 years?
Yeah, I'd say everything in the regulatory and quality space. There's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of technical issues. And I'd say for my career, and I think this applies to most people that I work with or worked for or worked or supervised, is experience counts for a lot sort of in this space. There's a level of book learning that we can all do and we all have to go through. But when I look at my experiences 3 years into this industry versus 10 years versus now 20 plus years into this industry, I've learned a lot. And it's not from reading different textbooks or reading different as regulations or guidances change, but it's dealing with those issues in real time, in real world environments, and trying to figure out what's the right and desired outcome in this particular scenario. And I use those terms not interchangeably. There's usually a right or wrong answer depending on regulatory. You can go down to the regulations, say, here's exactly what the regulations state. But there's always sort of a desired outcome as well. It's trying to understand, well, here's the intent behind the regulations, and here's where the client, the company, the product specifically sits. Here's the facts that apply in this specific example. And I don't want to imply that we're not going to reach the right answer, but trying to understand what's the intent behind those regulations, what are the core issues around safety, efficacy, patient protection, public health protection that the regulators think and care about and prioritize, will help drive you towards the right, the correct, the desired outcome there. And it's those experiences that over a course of a career you pull together that have really, I think, educated myself and I think educated most of my peers to get to the point that we are today.
Yeah, that's very much what I tell people all the time, even about consulting, is you get to see the best practices from many different places, see how many different companies do things and meet the same objectives in different ways, right? But like you said, that desired outcome, that's of topmost importance, when you're trying to guide your client, and it's very similar in the consulting space. So that's interesting to see.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think that best practices, the way I frame it with many of my clients is, you're paying me for my legal analysis, my regulatory opinion and sort of thinking there. But what you're also getting is all those experiences, all those industry benchmarks that I've acquired over the course of the last 20 plus years. And again, I'm never divulging clients' names or what the specific examples were, but go back to, 12 years ago, I remember we had a similar issue, but maybe the situations are different. I always say with all my clients, right sizing the solution for any organization or any product is sort of critical. So the right outcome for a $30 billion or a $70 billion organization is going to be different than right sizing a solution for a startup that's bringing their first product to market, and trying to balance that out while still understanding what are the regulatory requirements, what are the legal requirements is critical. And I think it's tying all those pieces together, which is where the breadth of career really helps out.
Yep, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. So when you're a few years starting out, were there any mentors or leaders that kind of helped bring you along and help you set you on your path?
Yeah, there's two that stand out there. I'm not going to mention them by name, but one was when I was at the agency. Actually, the first person who invited me in for that first job offer at FDA. She was a senior leader in the center director's office in CDRH, and she brought me in. And I think what she recognized in me was, as I said before, this is what I wanted to do. I was seeking out opportunities, exactly what her career had unfolded to be. And I think what's more common in that space is people sort of find it. They see a job posting, or they're an engineer and they learn about something. And when she saw that enthusiasm in me, she really took me under her wing and mentored me. And she was probably 3 steps above me. So she did offer me the job, but she was my boss's boss's boss at the time. And it comes up frequently in conversations now. We're now in this sort of post-COVID world where we're all working or many of us are working in hybrid, in-person, in-office, work-from-home situations. This particular mentor, she really looked out for me in the sense of there'd be meetings on her calendar. She'd know she's going in to meet with a specific client, or not client, but industry representative, meeting with a big company, a small company. And she'd walk by my office and she'd knock on my window and say, "Hey, Phil, I'm going to meet with XYZ company. Why don't you tag along?" And that frame of tagging along is exactly how she framed it. I went into those meetings. I really looked at my responsibility was to take notes and be able to communicate to her what were my observations, what were my thoughts coming out of that meeting. But I wasn't someone that quote unquote had to be at that meeting. If it was a Zoom meeting at the time, I probably wouldn't have been invited. But because she passed by my office, because she knew I had an interest in growing and learning in this space, she invited me into those in-person meetings or sometimes telephone meetings. And that inclusion, that inviting me to participate, was that mentorship that I really needed earlier on. She wasn't the type of mentor where we'd sit down and she'd say, well, what are your career goals for the next 5 years? But she knew the experiences, the skills that I needed to develop at those early stages of my career, and exposed me to those pieces. And that's what I worry about right now is if I were restarting my career in 2026, those types of opportunities aren't as easy to stumble into. When everything's taking place over a computer and a video screen, it's just a harder environment to bring in those more junior people who are really learning by observation. They might not have a concrete role in deciding or strategizing on what's happening there, but if there's not a way to bring them in, to expose them to those conversations, to see how other senior leaders are thinking about these issues, I think it's just much more challenging to go from that junior person in career even to that mid-level piece. There's a gap there that you really just need to experience and observe. And I go out of my way right now to try to pull people in to those experiences. So that was one opportunity. The other mentor that comes to mind was another leader. And it's funny, my first interaction with her was when I was at the agency and she was at a regulated company. She was head of regulatory affairs for one of the largest medtech organizations in the world. I remember meeting with her. I think our first meeting might have been around a Medufa conversation, Medufa 2 maybe. I know her company came in and had some conversations with the agency on some quality issues or some pre-market issues. And I remember thinking to myself, I really liked the way that she held herself, carried herself, communicated. She was really the mouthpiece and the face piece of this particular organization. And I remember thinking to myself, 10, 15 years from now, that's the type of role or the type of career or the type of leader that I would want to be. And we had a couple emails back and forth, maybe a couple hallway conversations during those pieces, and then sort of disappeared, didn't have an actual relationship with her. And then when I decided to leave the agency, I went to Arnold Porter, where I am right now as a counsel. And this client was a client of the firm, but she was also engaged in the trade associations, AVAMED and MDMA, and was just a real leader in the regulatory space. And she reached out to me. I didn't work for her. She wasn't offering me a job. And she said, Phil, I really appreciated our opportunities to collaborate and work together with the agency. I'd love to pick your brain on a couple different issues. And we started doing these meetings where she'd call, or not call me, we'd set up a meeting and we'd talk through some different issues, sometimes related to Medufa strategies, sometimes related to just some new policies or guidances that had come out of the agency. And I loved the way that she framed it for me. She asked me if I was willing to talk with her. The reality is she was 20 years my senior. She was 7 levels above where I hoped to be in my next role. But she framed it, and I think she knew it consciously what she was doing. She was mentoring me in a way that I really appreciated, both at the time right now, but she did it in a way where she made it feel like I was giving something to her. And I think I was. I had some unique experiences, some unique skill sets where I could share with her. But she really reached out to me and made me feel included in the larger private sector regulatory affairs group, whether it be TNR through AVAMED or some of the other conversations that were happening. She's probably one of the most experienced and senior leaders in those organizations. It's almost like you go back to middle school and the popular kid invites you to come sit at the lunch table. You feel like you're part of the group. And she sort of played that role for me. I think at my first AVAMED meeting, she introduced me to the group. She might've been co-chair of TNR at the time. And she invited me to dinner with a large group afterwards. And it really made me feel, for someone spent the last 10 years at FDA, maybe been in private practice for a year or two, and I'm entering this new group with a lot of people and faces that I've heard about but don't really know, but felt like I was a part of that group and welcomed me in there. And then over the course of my career, both of those people have been people that I've been able to tap back into, ask questions, whether it be career advice. Hey, I've got this career opportunity out here. Here are some of my concerns. What do you think about this? Those mentors like that are few and far between. And when you can really latch onto them, and it's a bi-directional flow of information and relationship, I found it really valuable in my career.
Awesome. You know, one thing that I heard in both stories is that at some point you let those mentors know that you were interested in going farther, and you were also coming to them for advice. And I think that is something, to your point, in this post-COVID time, is very difficult for people. And then also, in new generation where everything is, the iPads, the phones, the computers, that skill and that confidence to go up to somebody and ask them for help or ask them their advice. I can see that being a challenge for those to be able to get into those mentorship opportunities.
I think there's a couple of threads there that I'd love to pull on, Shawn. I think the first is, and I think it's a level of, I'm going to use the word humility. I'm not sure if that's the right word or not, but an acknowledgement going in, particularly when you're junior in career, of saying, I don't know everything and I'd love to learn. And I think having, number one, that mindset. I think if you have it yourself, it'll come through in your communications, but explicitly saying, hey, I'd love to pick your brain. I'd love to sit down and I'd love to model a career, something similar to yours. Can you help me understand what's going on here and here? I think everyone loves it. It's a little flattering, but there's a humility around saying, I want to learn and I've got something to learn from you. And I think by expressing that explicitly, people are always, in my experience, almost always willing to give back and sort of lean in to those communications. The other point, if I had any advice for anyone junior, and I just think about my career started in the government, and this is the lens I'm going to look at it through. One of the things that I found the government experience was really helpful in, if you go in there and you are willing to help out, you're willing to roll up your sleeves and learn, the amount of opportunity, exposure, and quite frankly, responsibility that the government will give you is unprecedented anywhere else sort of in the private sector. So I found in my first year or two, I'm literally an intern. I haven't even graduated law school yet. And I'd go into meetings and I'd say, you're working on a guidance document on drug-eluting stents. I barely know what a stent is, but I'd love to help participate. What can I do to help? And in those meetings, my role was literally note taker. Everybody goes around the room, talks about what they think should be in there. I'll walk out of there and I'll take pen to paper. I'll be the first. I'll take all your ideas and I'll try to put them down on paper the way that I heard them. I'm going to get 80% of that stuff wrong. But starting out and taking on that initiative, they empowered me to play that particular role. And it wasn't that someone came to me and said, hey, second year intern, can you come and play this role? But it's one where you sit down and you ask, what can I do to help? And as soon as you make that request, they'll say, well, here are 3 things you can do. And until you prove, or at least until you prove you're not competent to do something, they'll assume you can get it done. And I really found if you lean into that environment and that mindset of, I'm here to learn, I'm here to help, I'm going to volunteer my time, and I'm going to ask for the assignments, you just get tremendous exposure and opportunities are put in front of you. And I think for me, at least, that was one of the keys to growth early on in my career.
Yeah, no, absolutely. What's interesting is sort of, I think, assumed in your stories here is that you are somebody who follows through. So not only did they give you the opportunity, but if you came back and you didn't follow through or didn't do a good job on it, those opportunities probably would have come, fewer and farther between. But building that reputation for doing what it is you say you're going to do, taking those opportunities, I think is a huge key for somebody who's much more senior, taking their time to address, give you advice, invest their time in you. So I think not only just asking for it, but also following through, to add on to your point, extremely key.
Yeah, I think there are 3 components to developing like strong reputation to be successful in anything. It's got nothing to do with regulatory, but it's showing up, following through on your commitments, and then having the substantive, it's not even expertise, but doing good work. The good work is going to come or it's not going to come. That'll stand for itself. But if you show up, if you volunteer, if you go where the conversations are happening, that's step 1. If you're not there, just nothing's going to come. The second piece is when you make commitments, say, I'll take on that responsibility. I'll take notes. I'll follow up with a particular answer. If you follow up the way that you say you will, people come to rely on you. If you don't follow up, they stop inviting you to the meetings and you stop being able to participate. So those 2 elements, I think, are critical in anything that anybody's doing. And in our industry, in regulatory quality, it absolutely carries through as well.
Yep. Absolutely. So now let's transition a little bit to the industry side of it, because we see the 21 years of experience, FDA, in-house counsel, law firm. Now, clearly you have a lot of different lenses to look through. What is it that you see now in 2026, almost said 2025, with the new QSMR coming in place, and just the general state of life science industry right now?
Yeah. So when I look at it, again, everything I do is going to be through a regulatory quality lens. And when I think through what are the issues sort of in play, I think change is the only constant. Every year there's going to be new policies, going to be regulation updates. There's going to be new personalities in the regulating organizations and industry that we're going to have to deal with. So change is always happening, but it's how do we think about that change? How do we react to that change? How do we plan for that change? I think that's what I've tried to think through and sort of make my constant is when I look back to the training I received back at FDA, and this is the lens that I put everything through, is like, how are regulators going to look at this? There's some guiding principles around the regulation, both pre-market and post-market, of therapeutic and diagnostic products that are going to cut through. And oftentimes, whenever I'm interpreting a new regulatory standard, a new policy, a new guidance, I try to think through what was the goal of this policy? What were the regulators thinking or worried about when they crafted this? Why did they create this exception? Why did they put this specific example into the guidance document? Why are they silent on this particular piece? And I try to look at it as high level as I possibly can. At the end of the day, I'm going to speak largely from FDA, but I think this generally applies to most regulators. They're looking at how do we protect the patients and the citizens of our jurisdiction and make sure the medical products and diagnostics are safe and effective. If that's the foundational piece of all pieces of regulatory requirements, new policies, then I look at what are the words that they've put down? What is the what do the laws say? What do the regulations say? How are those being crafted, interpreted, recrafted, reinterpreted to fit the needs of the current culture? 2026 is different than 2025, is way different than 2002. So what's evolved? What's changing there? If I can go back to why might this policy have changed? What's driving this change? And what are the regulators hoping to accomplish? That's where I start. And then I try to use the regulatory language to fit the narrative that I think the agency or the regulator was trying to craft. That's how I look at it. And I think that's probably the easiest and simplest way to think, how do we navigate this change? The rules themselves may change day to day, week to week, year to year. But if we understand the overall goals of the government and the regulators, I think that gives us the right mindset and the right framework to think about regulatory compliance.
So not so much focused on meeting the requirements A, B, C, D, which obviously you still got to do, but aiming more so to meet the intent of what the regulators wanted by creating requirements A, B, C, D.
Yeah, and I think the new quality system regulation is a great example to look at. Mm-hmm. Fundamentally, I think for most U.S.-based device manufacturers, the new requirements for the new quality system management regulation aren't significantly different from where the old FDA requirements were. They're, if anything, they are more closely aligned to where the international standards are. Obviously, I mean, not obvious. It's very transparent. ISO 13485 was the basis for it, and the goal was to try to align more quality regulations globally to make quality easier, more efficient, better across the entire world for all global patients. If we understand that there weren't major shifts in FDA's thinking about what does it mean to be a quality-focused organization, to make quality medical device and diagnostic products, to have the appropriate systems in place, then it's really a change in how those requirements and expectations are articulated to more closely align with some other global standards. We can think through what an update or mitigation strategy might look like. When we're thinking about a U.S. company migrating from the old Part 20 to the new Part 20, we can think about the very specific changes that are in the regulation that need to be accounted for. But if we start from an assumption of FDA's overall thinking hasn't dramatically shifted, but there are some different ways of interpreting or looking at the very explicit requirements, it makes the job a little bit easier. We don't necessarily need to throw everything out, but we think about what are the tweaks that need to be made to reflect the new changes, as opposed to looking at it and saying, well, I've got to start from scratch and I've got to go through. And I'm not suggesting you don't need to go through regulation by regulation. That's definitely one of the final steps. But when you're planning out your overall strategy, understanding that maybe this change isn't as big as you might have thought from the get-go.
Very interesting. That's I think just from what I've heard in the industry so far, I think people have been a little worried about what the change is going to be to a certain extent because it is very similar. It's basically, like you said, 13485. But there's the concern about, okay, the investigators, now they're going to be able to see so much more. Will it go very similar to the notified body audits? Will it be, different, things of that nature? And so what's your thoughts on that? How will those audits and the actions that come out of these different inspections be different from what they're used to seeing?
So I think it depends on the type of organization we're talking about. If you are a relatively small, or at least a U.S.-centric medical device manufacturer that designed your entire quality systems around U.S. FDA compliance, there's definitely going to be changes at the way an FDA auditor conducts and thinks about an inspection, whether it be for cause or a planned audit. They're obviously going to be looking at the new rules, the new inspectional guidance, the new quality system regulation. So maybe some significant changes there in terms of how you plan or your interactions with your inspector themselves. But for the larger, or maybe I should frame it more as sort of the more multinationally focused organizations, if you've got a supply chain footprint that spans 7 different countries, 30 different facilities, and already have a single quality system that encapsulates all of those facilities, you've already built in your 1345 compliance expectations. If anything, I think your inspections are probably going to get a little bit easier. They're going to be a little bit more streamlined. You're going to see more similarities between a global audit from a notified body, an MDSAP audit, or even an FDA-specific audit. Now they are much more closely aligned in terms of, again, not their overall expectations. I think fundamentally how they think about quality is very similar across most jurisdictions, but the actual textualized requirements in terms of what your quality system has to have, how it should look, how things are titled and framed and organized, more synergies, more harmonization across jurisdictions, in my opinion, will ultimately benefit those multinational organizations that had crafted these U.S.-centric or U.S.-specific carve-outs to their quality system to account for the old Part 820 that now I think will be a little bit more streamlined across the globe.
No, very good, very good. Speaking of those multinationals, always a big strategy for growth for them is M&A activity. How do you see the fact that they have their quality system maybe harmonized together within their current base of companies, divisions, departments, and then now they're adding on M&A? How important is it to make sure that this quality discussion is a part of the due diligence and post-implementation?
Yeah, I think there's 2 elements there that are worth diving into. I think first, making sure that regulatory and quality have their own dedicated diligence work stream, that an acquiring organization fully understands the quality, compliance, regulatory strategies that are in place in the target company are critical for both making a decision and valuing targets and companies that they're looking at. I've been involved in probably hundreds of diligences over the course of my career, and they generally fall into 2 categories. And again, I'm usually providing regulatory and quality support. In some instances, most instances, regulatory and quality is at a minimum going to be looked at. But in some instances, regulatory and quality are part of the go, no-go decision. What does the quality infrastructure for this organization look like? What are the regulatory expectations for an organization of this size? How would it fit into the existing organization? And as you're starting to understand that, you can understand how seamlessly or not seamlessly will this new entity fit within the existing structure. Best case scenario, if they're largely aligned, you can either integrate one quality system into the other. But sometimes you figure out, hey, these quality, they're not framed the same way. It's going to be difficult to make them work together. Or sometimes you just realize, hey, this target just isn't operating at the level of sophistication that we thought or had anticipated. And the cost of remediation is going to be so significant that maybe it's not worth doing this deal at all. So on both sides of that transaction, I think it's really important that both organizations invest in on the acquiring side, invest in understanding what is the quality and regulatory infrastructure that we're potentially acquiring. On the flip side of that, if you're the company or the target that's being acquired, make sure that you've got someone that can clearly articulate what does your quality system, what does your quality strategy, your regulatory strategy look like? Because I've seen a handful of deals fall apart, not necessarily because the quality and regulatory infrastructure wasn't there, but because the acquiring company didn't fully understand it and thought to work within the system was going to be more complicated than they're willing to get into. And again, most of these targets, there are other alternatives out there. So understanding, all right, how do we make sure that the organization that we're working with or trying to be acquired by understands the nuances, the overall structure of our system, but also the flexibility or lack of flexibility that may exist in a post-acquisition, post-merger situation. So I think that's one side of it. Should this deal actually go through? The other side, and I've been parts of these discussions as well, oftentimes the deal's, I don't say the deal's done, but for strategic reasons, company A is going to acquire company B, and that's going to happen regardless of how complicated the quality or regulatory integration is going to look. But what can be really valuable in that process is valuing and anticipating how much time, effort, and money is going to be required to either remediate this quality system, to integrate these quality system, having a plan over the course of the next 12 months, 5 years. What's the plan? Are we going to be running 2 or maybe more quality systems in parallel? At some point, are we looking to integrate? Maybe there's a larger quality system that will absorb the other quality systems. What's that transition going to look like? What's the appropriate timeline for that? So valuing that. When I ran regulatory and quality teams during integration activities, the hardest part was when you're not in part of that process and someone says, all right, we're putting this on your lap. You've now got this great business that's now part of your business as well. But you didn't run that regulatory diligence. You didn't run that quality diligence. And you haven't been assigned any budget to integrate this. And when you get it, you say, well, I've identified 2 years worth of work and $6 million worth of remediation activities. And you're telling me to absorb that with the 20 FTEs that I have. It's just not going to get done.
Right.
We're not going to be able to meet that need with the resources that we have. So part of when I look at my responsibilities as outside counsel during a regulatory quality diligence is first and foremost, making sure that my clients understand what is it that they're acquiring, what are they getting into. The second point, in almost every diligence, you're going to find some things that could be done. I'm going to use the term different, but some might use better. There's different levels of sophistication that might need to exist. And for my clients, what I try to do is articulate, here's what needs to be done and try to give them a timeline, but also suggest that they need to create a budget and figure out, all right, I've identified 15 things that need to be done over the course of the next 30 days or next 3 years. Let's make sure that those responsibilities sit within a dedicated part of the organization. Maybe it's a regulatory team or a quality team or an integration leader, and make sure that they understand and have the necessary resources to get those elements and aspects complete.
I could not agree with you more. I've seen that myself throughout my consulting opportunities. It's so many things could be done earlier in the process. There was no reason to start that late in the game. But unfortunately, just sometimes the quality, the regulatory piece isn't as big of a bigger part of the decision, as you said. Maybe you don't have data, but maybe anecdotally, do you have some thoughts on the ones that do take quality and regulatory very much a part of the decision in the beginning of the due diligence and how they perform afterwards? Do you have any sort of insight on that?
I think there's a couple of things that, and there's some generalizations going on here. In my experience, a lot depends on what is the commercial stage of the target company. So for example, if this is a company or a product that's been on the market for 15 years, you can do some pretty good diligence and analysis. What are I've probably got 15 plus examples of FDA or MDSAP or other regulatory authority inspections that can give me a good snapshot of like, how are the authorities thinking about this quality system? Have there been issues in the past? Let me understand recalls. Let me understand market share and size and scale that this company is operating in. In those situations, we can identify things on the regulatory quality side, but they're generally relatively easy to mitigate. It doesn't mean that they're going to be cheap, but it means we can generally wrap our hands around them and think through, all right, what is an appropriate timeline and process to bring them into, from the acquiring company's perspective, up to our standards. That's relatively easy. And in my experience, those regulatory and quality diligences tend not to be hugely impactful in the decision to move forward. But where they can be impactful is how you value that particular company. If I tell my business development leader, hey, we've got $10 million of quality remediation that's going to need to take place on a $60 million deal, well, we've got to absolutely need to factor that into the overall price and make sure that that's accounted for. The flip side of that is when you've got a pre-revenue or maybe even pre-clearance, pre-approval technology. You've got an idea and maybe a well thought out regulatory strategy, but this product has not gone through regulatory approvals. This product and this company and these establishments have not been inspected by any authorities. There's a lot more risk associated with those. And oftentimes a target company will come into a strategic and say, here's our regulatory strategy. We're highly confident that we're going to be a class in the US, a class 2 510K product. There's 7 examples of 510Ks that have been cleared in the last 2 years. We don't see any regulatory challenges with getting this product on the market. And the reason they say that is because they want to look through everything with rose-colored glasses. They want to see the optimism and how are we going to get to market in the next 18 months and everything's going to be smooth sailing. What I've seen in those scenarios is you bring in a strategic regulatory and quality diligence expert, and you can identify some risks in that regulatory strategy that they've articulated to you. Of those 6 or 7 510Ks that have been cleared, well, here's some significant and really important distinctions between those products and your products. Here's a de novo that seems kind of similar to what you did, but still not 100% identified explicitly the same way that your product is. But there's a good risk that FDA might look at this and say, hey, there's some novel elements associated with this technology, and we think we're going to kick you into this de novo process, or maybe even the PMA process. When a strategic is looking to acquire a technology, and they've assigned it a value, and they think there is a 6 to 9 month regulatory pathway and a couple $100,000 of resources that need to be invested to get this product on the market, and the diligence reveals, yeah, that's possible, but we also could potentially see the need for a $2 million clinical trial. It's going to take us 24 months to collect that information, another year to put our PMA package together, and another year of this product or the submission sitting with FDA. Now we're 4 years away from the first income dollar coming in associated with that product. That's where I feel those go, no-go decisions are a little bit more likely to occur from a regulatory and quality perspective.
Mm-hmm. And one thing that you said before as well is that, correct me if I'm wrong, you said that the company being acquired, some deals haven't gone through because they couldn't adequately communicate how their quality system could integrate. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So would you say it would be wise for companies who are in the process or open to being bought to, like, let's say, work with somebody who can actually communicate?
Sean, I know, I see the trap you're trying to set here. You're trying to make me feel like I'm selling something, but I think your question is really valid. And I've come in on a couple deals and diligence like this in the past. We've got a relatively small company, really interesting technology that's of tremendous value to a strategic. And they get into deal negotiations, and usually they've got outside counsel or consultants helping on a variety of issues. But hey, we've got an SVP of quality and regulatory. We'll let them respond to any of the diligence questions. And we think we got it managed out here. We don't need to spend this additional external money. In a couple of those scenarios, oftentimes the responses that come forward from those in-house people, it's not that they're wrong. It's not that they don't understand or appreciate the full nuance of what's being asked, but they've got day jobs. They've got to keep the business running. They've got to keep oversight of the overall quality and regulatory things that are happening there. Having been on both sides of these deals, many in the consulting and legal space understand, well, what was that question designed to get at? Did they really just want to see the last 2 examples of the FDA inspections, or are they looking for themes or elements or potential flags and signals from the regulators of things that they want to dive deeper into? So an example comes to mind from, this was about 2 years ago, where I got pulled in a little bit later into a diligence. And the 483 from a relatively recent inspection was transmitted back to the strategic organization. with no additional messaging. It's like, oh, here's our 483, and it had a couple observations in there. And my immediate response, and they hadn't heard anything back from the strategic yet. And my immediate conversation to my client was, well, you've been asked for and provided this information. Here's why I think why they requested this information. And if I got this without any additional explanation, here's what I would interpret from it. And that interpretation wouldn't be wrong, but it wouldn't be fully complete. So my suggestion and my recommendation to this particular client was, what we need to do is we need to set up a call and explain what else was happening around this audit, what happened in the 30 days immediately following the issuance of that 483, and why did it not escalate from a 483 to a warning letter? Because we did get an official closeout there, but what were the oral and/or written communications that were not requested in this diligence request that were communicated to FDA? It's painting that fuller picture, which I believe opposing counsel was able to appreciate and fully see. All right, there was a potential issue here, but without the full story, it could have been a deal breaker. But when you provide the full context of what happens, the context and the commitments that the company made and ultimately fulfilled to FDA that made this issue no longer relevant and fully addressed, that's the context that I think somebody that's operated in multiple of these diligences adds to the process. And that's where I think, whether it be a regulatory consultant, a regulatory lawyer that does this on a daily basis, that's how they add value and keep these deals from falling apart when they don't need to or shouldn't. Or on the other side, make sure that an acquiring company has eyes wide open and understanding what are they acquiring, what risks and liabilities are they acquiring if this deal were to go through.
Excellent. Excellent. All right. All right. So as far as the future, obviously, who knows what can happen in the next year sometimes, but where do you see things heading from a regulation standpoint, or maybe just the industry as a whole, that looking from your legal and regulatory perspective would be important for listeners or the audience to know?
Yeah, so I think we're now we are January 21st, so 366 days post inauguration. You're looking at the last year. I'd say we're looking at an FDA, a more transient or transformative FDA in the last year than we've seen probably the last 15 years combined. Significant changes in leaderships and even regulatory philosophy. In the last 2 weeks, we've seen CDRH in particular issue two revised guidance documents that I would say take a deregulatory perspective on how FDA should be regulating different types of products, whether it be general wellness products, software products. They've signaled some upcoming changes with regards to digital health and artificial intelligence technology sort of moving forward. So over the course of the next 2 to 3 years, and probably over the course of the next 6 months, we do anticipate some significant changes, and probably from a deregulatory standpoint of how the agency is going to be looking at what products should they regulate. What we're seeing more change and movement in is what are the types of products that FDA thinks it should be focusing its attention on, as opposed to changes in how they apply. So the distinctions we saw in the general wellness guidance document and some other guidance documents are FDA attempting to carve out areas where they don't think they need to be playing an active regulatory role. These are either lower risk or areas where we want to let the marketplace sort of identify and move forward. So I think we're going to see more of that over the next couple months, particularly around artificial intelligence and digital health. But the foundations of how FDA and CDRH regulate those products, I don't see major shifts changing if you're regulated by FDA. Their expectations on bench testing, clinical testing, cybersecurity, human factors. I don't anticipate seeing much changes in there, but there are going to be some types and categories of products that maybe a year ago might have found themselves under the peer review of FDA that a year from now might not. So understanding and trying to predict where those areas might be is a real opportunity for the industry.
Interesting. So as far as let's look at the process, because I think one thing that many people don't know, especially working with a FDA attorney, regulatory, legal, not many people get to interact directly with you on a regular basis. So they may not know where you fit into the whole process. Let's say in terms of remediation or enforcement activities or even an M&A. Could you walk us through where you normally fit in to that process?
Yeah, I'll walk you through a couple of different buckets of where I usually engage with some of my newer clients. The first is sort of on the M&A, the transactional space. When you're going through a transaction, a deal, most of the larger sophisticated organizations, when they're acquiring different assets, they are thinking through. They want to do regulatory diligence. They want to do quality diligence. They want to understand what are they acquiring, what's the risk associated with that. So oftentimes, either my firm, Arnold Porter, will be handling the overall transaction, and there'll be an element around quality and regulatory diligence. Oftentimes, our firm will come in specifically for that regulatory and quality analysis and work hand in hand with other law firms that might be handling other parts of the transaction. And oftentimes, that's where we'll start the relationship. We'll come in and I'll say, hey, here's my expert perspective as to what's happening from a regulatory and quality perspective with this particular organization. So that's bucket number one. It's usually isolated in time. Deals can take anywhere from a couple weeks to a couple years to sort of play out. But handling a transaction, handling a diligence like that is relatively common. It's relatively well-defined and scoped out. I'd say the more interesting aspect of where I get involved with clients is when they're going through some type of crisis. Maybe FDA came in, conducted an inspection and found something the company wasn't aware of or that they weren't anticipating. And FDA is starting to raise questions around the overall quality, safety of a particular product. Now the company's worried, well, have we addressed FDA's concerns adequately? Do we need a quality remediation program? Do we need to be thinking about, or they should always be thinking about a recall, but do we need a recall? If we do need a recall, how should we craft these communications appropriately to our customers, to our stakeholders, to the agency itself? So that's often where I'll get involved. As a regulatory lawyer, I don't do litigation. I'm not in the courtroom on a regular basis. But oftentimes when recalls are identified, this can be the genesis of litigations, products liability litigation. So as FDA communicates, hey, we've identified a class 1 recall for XYZ product, plaintiffs' lawyers are all absolutely paying attention. They're thinking through, all right, well, if FDA has identified the safety signal, maybe we need to look at what are the actual impacts? What are the potential harm that's been caused by these products? And now my clients are starting to think about, well, from a defensive standpoint, what might I need to be prepared for? If plaintiff lawyers reach out, how do we handle those conversations? And that's where our cross-functional group within Arnold Porter, our litigators, our general compliance attorneys, our regulatory quality attorneys will think through, all right, what should we be anticipating, not just as we close out this recall, this inspection, this regulatory quality piece, but what could or should we be anticipating over the course of the next year as this information comes out there more publicly?
Got it. So that's where you normally fit into those two buckets. Of course, the question that we always want is, when would you like them to reach out to you in those two buckets?
The answer is always as soon as possible. And I think the answer there, and I know this, I mean, nobody wants to need a lawyer. If we're being honest, whether it's in your personal life, it's a real estate transaction, it's a business deal, you think about lawyers when things are starting to go wrong. And that's 80% of the time, that's when we get called into it. But with most of my clients, we're establishing longer term relationships where you're understanding, they're saying, hey, Phil, we're looking at this specific type of technology. We're targeting these 3 companies. Can you give us your perspective on what do you see from a regulatory quality position, just on publicly available information? It's ongoing engagement, and that's not generally costly. This is a couple hours of work that gets built into the business decision process, so that when the board is meeting, when the presidents of a particular part of the organization are thinking through, is company A, B, or C more attractive, they've got a little bit of additional information to consider as they're making those determinations. I always feel like those relationships are the one where I'm adding the most value, because I'm absolutely there to put out any fires to address the specific issues. But you're also part of the journey. You're providing your perspective in real time before some of those issues pop up.
And I think going back to the example you gave about the why behind why a question is asked and the value that you're bringing to that particular client, the more you know about that client, the more you're going to be able to help them and understand their real why. Why are they asking the question? What type of companies are they looking for? How does this fit into their overall portfolio? As opposed to being called in at the moment a deal is about to get done, you're already going to due diligence. And I can imagine that can be extremely helpful from a strategic standpoint, the earlier you are involved in the process.
Some good examples. So I couldn't agree more there, Shawn. One of the things that I think about is for a lot of my clients, I work on pre-market issues, post-market issues, help support internal audits, help support external audits from various health authorities. But if I know your quality system, because I've lived it, because I've had to explain it to FDA, because we've had to do remediation activities, I understand it at a fundamental level, different than if you send me your quality system documentation and I'm just reading through it. I think you look at those, a lot of them are relatively complex, but you don't understand the nuances until you've had to apply them to real world situations. And if I've got clients that I've managed 2 recalls for them and we've handled 3 different FDA audits and we've come out successfully them, and then they're thinking about integrating some new business or some new technology or company into theirs, and I'm looking at that target's quality system, I've got a much deeper understanding of how those organizations and how those systems are going to work with each other, potentially for each other or against each other, than if I'm just looking at 2 documents on paper. So to me, the deeper I understand the business, the culture of that organization, the more effective and value add I can bring to those conversations on the transactions or those very specific response issues.
No, that's good information. That's good information. I did want to transition here to some of the personal items, the life guiding principles that you find when you look back over your career was extremely helpful to you, extremely important to remember, that if you were advising yourself 21 years ago, what would you give yourself as a principle to move forward in life?
I think there's a couple things that come to mind. I think the first one that jumps out to me, and I think one of the reasons that I've been able to craft whatever my level of success is, that I'm fully happy with and content with, is creating a specific area or niche is how I might think about it, where I truly have expertise. And I don't think this, so there are some types of lawyers, if you're a general practitioner, you think about the classic lawyer in a small town and they're doing wills and estates and a criminal trial here and a civil trial there, a little bit of a jack of all trades. I think that is a very difficult both business model and personal sort of professional model to sort of go on. The way that I think about my career is that I've invested all of my professional activities to become the best and strongest I can possibly be as an FDA and to some degree global regulatory and quality expert, particularly in the medical device space. I said before, devices and diagnostics is where 95% of my work lists. If a client comes to me and says, hey, can you tell me about this biologics issue? Can we talk about it? I'm more than happy to talk to them. But what I want to do is I want to hand them off to the most knowledgeable subject matter expert that I know, and I work with some of the best, and say, here's my thoughts, but you want to talk to the expert. There's 3 people in the world that know the answer, know this in and out, and I want you to talk to one of those people. That's what I want to be. I want to be one of those 3 most knowledgeable people in the world in my very narrow sliver of medical device, FDA, regulatory, and quality work from a legal perspective. And I know there are a number of people that do this throughout DC and throughout the world. But when I think about the blend that I've tried to approach my career with, I've got 10 years of experience working for a regulator in the government. I've got 10 years of experience working for one of the larger, more sophisticated medtech organizations out there. I've got a number of years experience operating in private practice. Blending all 3 of those experiences together is how I look at my career, the advice that I'm providing you. If you come to me and ask me a question, you're going to get an answer that is based on being a previous regulator, having ran a regulatory and quality team at a large medtech organization, having had numerous conversations with startups around the struggles that they go through from a regulatory and quality perspective. And I believe this to my core, that if you're talking about a pre-market or post-market regulatory legal issue, there's a very small handful of people that have the true expertise that can say literally, right, of all the people in the world, we've got the most experience and the most knowledge in that space. And that's where I feel the most confident. If you come to me in that very narrow area where I know I can go toe to toe with anybody else in the world around my expertise, my experience, and my skill set, that's where I feel comfortable. That's where I love working. You ask me one of those questions, I don't sit there and struggle and worry if Shawn's going to stump me with some question I've never heard of before. Don't get me wrong. You absolutely can stump me, but it's not because it's something I should have known. It's because it's a unique issue that we've never faced before. We haven't discussed, or I need to understand more of the facts. And my advice to myself or to anyone else, whether it's early in career or anywhere in your career, is if you can carve out that area of expertise where you genuinely believe you are one of the experts in this particular space, you're probably going to enjoy what you're going to do. You're going to have confidence in the work that you're going to do. And the clients will find you. The people that need that expertise, whether it be they're going to be asking for referrals. Hey, I've got this issue. I've got a real estate transaction. I'm going to go to my friends and say, hey, who's the expert that knows this very specific piece of this particular code? And I want them to point me to that subject matter expert. I want to be that subject matter expert for the stuff that I care about and that I'm passionate about.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. Deep in expertise, wide in network.
I think that's a great strategy.
Yeah. Very nice, very nice. What about the famous question of the work-life balance? Both my parents were doctors. They worked all the time, but they found very creative ways to try and figure out how to work things out, with the family, with the work side. And, it had its challenging parts, but it also was rewarding in the end, especially seeing them devoted to their particular craft. What advice would you give yourself 21 years ago as far as balancing work life, and if that's even a thing that's even possible?
So I'd say it's absolutely positive. It's absolutely possible, but it requires a little planning and thinking. And I think table stakes to be successful in anything in life are probably you're going to work hard. I think everyone, Shawn, I know you personally. I know you work hard in everything that you do. I apply that same level of effort to everything that I do. But working hard doesn't mean only working. It doesn't mean giving up every personal freedom. It doesn't mean making yourself available at all hours of the day, anytime a client wants to jump on a call with you. It means when you're focused and you're working on a particular project, you're putting everything you have into solving that issue, into working on that particular sort of problem. For me, finding that balance is around working hard when I am working as efficiently as possible, but also creating and carving out time for myself, time for my family. I'm raising 3 boys. I think my most important job is to be a strong father and to be a good role model and to spend time with them. And the way that I think about that is, number one, making sure that I do spend time on the weekends, in the evenings, being at the soccer games and the lacrosse games and taking them on ski vacations, things like those are things that I both fundamentally enjoy, but I think are also memories that are part of being a parent that I think are critical to that primary role of being a father. But there's also a level of flexibility that as we get more senior and comfortable in our careers that I think we have to lean into and say take advantage. It's not taking advantage of anything. It's being creative. When I think about, not so much now, but I think back to my time when I was at Johnson Johnson. I ran some global teams and I had team members stationed in Europe and Asia and different parts of the US. And I had to have one-on-ones with them on a regular basis. And it was very common in my household where I'd be interacting with my family and it would be 10 p.m. and I'd say, hey guys, I got to go upstairs and I got to do an hour-and-a-half call with China because we got to work through this issue. I didn't work from 9 a.m. in the morning until midnight. I worked when the work needed to be done. I took the time, enjoyed myself, leaned into all my responsibilities, including my professional ones, but could pause and say, all right, at 6 o'clock, I'm going to go home. I'm going to do dinner with my family. I'm going to do the activities that I need to do. But there's an expectation at some point at 9:58, I got to crack that laptop back open. I got to go back, put myself in my workspace, put the button-down shirt on again, take the t-shirt off, and find the time to be effective there. And again, it goes both ways for those China team members. I tried to go back and forth. Sometimes one of us is going to have to be up at 10 p.m. at night. One day, week 1, it'll be me. Week 2, we're going to schedule it the other way around. But trying to find that balance, I think also being cognizant of other people's boundaries as well. What I always try to do, and I learned this from a boss more than a couple of years ago. I'd get these emails at the timeline on the email would be 2:32 a.m. And it'd be this 2 or 3 paragraphs of here's what I need, here's the analysis that we talked about from last week. And the final paragraph would be clear expectations on what they needed from me and when they needed it. So clarifying, the example that I'm thinking about was this email comes in at 2:30 a.m. and the final paragraph is, Phil, I'm on a plane traveling back from Europe, or maybe it was Asia at this point, giving this to you now. Don't need a response until 3 days from now. Get back to me at your convenience. Providing that clarity of what the expectations were really valuable. And when it comes from your boss, it means a lot. If I didn't get that paragraph and he writes me at 2:30 and wake up at 8 a.m. and I check my phone and I see it there, now I'm scrambling. It's been 6 hours since this email came in. I don't know where in the world he is. How do I get a response back as quickly as possible? And in reality, me spending 3 hours first thing in the morning would have been not the best prioritization. He doesn't know that I'm putting that level of priority on it. So what I've tried to do when I know whether it be based on the importance of the issue, the time that I'm sending that email, how I'm framing it, the level of seniority of the person that I'm talking to, try to make it clear if I don't need a response by 9 a.m. tomorrow, if I don't need a response by Sunday morning at 10 p.m., make it clear what my expectations are and when I'm going to turn to this next, so that the people below me, the people that might be worried about how do I think about them, understand what my expectations are and can find that balance for themselves as well.
That is a great piece of advice, and I'm actually going to steal that one. That is extremely freeing, I can imagine, for people who are working there. They can properly plan. They're not using excess or what they think is their margin time for something that's not urgent. They can properly plan and figure out when they can do things so they can balance their life.
And Shawn, don't get me wrong. There are some issues that I got to spend 12 hours on a Saturday afternoon. That's not how I want to be spending that Saturday afternoon. But the last thing I want to do is think I need to do something on that Saturday afternoon when nobody else cares about it until Wednesday. Understanding what are the real drivers of priority and what are sort of some of the, in a vacuum of all the information, sometimes we think, well, I got this email on Friday night, I got to get it turned around as quickly as possible. That, I think, is the biggest piece that can negatively impact that work-life balance. If you don't understand what the true priorities are, how can you be expected to meet them appropriately?
Amazing. Well, Phil, anything else that you want to add to the conversation?
No, I think it goes back to one of your earlier questions on how do I think about sort of my role? And I just go back to that niche. The deeper I think about my expertise, if I can work with clients and on issues that I feel like I really have a unique perspective and I can really add value to those conversations, I truly enjoy that. And that's where my professional passion comes from. Those areas where they're unique issues, they're new issues, they're issues that are going to make a difference to people, to companies, to businesses, to products. I find that truly rewarding. And that's why I enjoy working in this industry so much.
Amazing. Thanks, Phil. Appreciate it. And till next episode, take care and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Shawn.